I'm not used to them. I want to thank you for the accolades and the introduction. And but you know, my husband and I appreciate it all. But my goodness, we feel that you all here today and everyone else has made Ventura County what it is today. It's such a wonderful place to live, and we are so fortunate to live in the decade of the 1920s with all our modern conveniences and healthcare available. These past few years, we've seen some wonderful progress throughout the county. When the Ventura oil field was drilled in 1919, well, that brought better roads and a major real estate boom, and then more culture and development for our area. The Ventura Theater, Mission Theater, Hotel Ventura on Main Street, and oh, have you seen the beautiful Bank of Italy? Just to name a few. Oh, and the first national bank built just this year, 1926, is 4 stories tall. Elsewhere in the community, things are booming too. Since that movie, The Sheik, was filmed in Oxnard in 1921, Hollywood stars are flocking to the beaches and buying little cottages in communities called Silver Strand and Hollywood by the Sea. And I hear that there is a plan for development here in Hueneme on the ocean called Ormond Beach, after that famous resort in Florida. Well, who would have thought all of this might come to Ventura County? I'm happy to say that agriculture is still important in our community, and I hope it always will be. Lima beans and sugar beets are still growing strong, and there is direct steam service now from the Hueneme port to the Atlantic coast in only 18 days. And now many of the farmers have diversified into lemons, and they're being shipped off out of Hueneme also to faraway ports in droves. Speaking of Hueneme, did you know that there are now 2 sun-kissed packing plants providing jobs for so many in your town? And I hear that young Richard Bard has plans to develop a larger port here for the benefit of all the county businesses. Won't that be wonderful? Well, some of you here may remember it wasn't always like this. Things were harder in the so-called good old days. There were none of the modern conveniences back then that we have in the 1920s. There weren't even paved roads then. In fact, if you didn't stay in the wagon ruts, you could get lost in the mustard. One of my husband's favorite stories is about driving out through the Santa Clara Valley and standing on the seat of his wagon, barely able to see over the wild mustard, which he said was thicker than the hair on a dog's back. Back then, it was an all-day trip to town for supplies. We didn't have bridges across rivers or electricity, running water, dry goods stores, groceries, trains, nothing but the land. Well, I heard that you wanted to hear the full story, so let's start with my humble beginnings. I was born on April 28th, 1850, in Avon, near Galesburg, Illinois. I came to California with my sister Phoebe when I was but 22 years of age. We had an exciting 10-day journey by rail across the continent to San Francisco, and then we boarded the old steamer. Maybe you heard of the Calorama? It was big news when it wrecked a few years later. What an adventure for a hometown girl, experiencing my first train ride and my first time on the ocean all in one trip. It was December 10th, 1872, when we arrived in Santa Barbara. Now, Bard's Wharf had opened in 1872, and we had arrived in the same year. I'm not sure why we didn't dock here instead of Santa Barbara. Maybe it was only for commercial use at the time, I'm not sure. Well, when we left Illinois, everything was frozen and covered with snow. Imagine our amazement at roses blooming and tomato vines blossoming. It seemed to me then that we had located paradise. But then, the first rain of the season arrived in earnest on Christmas Day. Desperately needing rain, our California friends rejoiced exceedingly. But I confess to having been a very homesick girl. I had never before passed a Christmas Day without a big dinner and a gathering of friends and family. But here in California that year, well, the local roads were impassable. And so gatherings of any sort were out of the question. I soon adapted to my new surroundings and was taken on many trips throughout the county, meeting many fine folk along the way. This was right around the time that Ventura County was formed, breaking away from Santa Barbara County. Back in the 1870s, there weren't as many towns as nowadays. Ventura was the first, and then there was Hueneme, Santa Paula, Nordhoff, which we call Ojai now, Piru, and Fillmore. When I first got to California, I taught school here and there. Once, while living at my sister's home on Ventura Avenue, I taught school in Santa Coy for a couple of months, going back and forth on weekends on the old Concord stage line that ran between Los Angeles and Santa Barbara. Oh my, those 4 horses would rush down one side of the Bronca and up the other with a recklessness that almost drove the heads of the passengers right through the top of the coach at times. I was exhilarated by the ride. Of course, I was a lot younger then. Well, I got through that first rainy winter and attended a May Day picnic. I met many other people, but of course one handsome young man caught my eye and eventually won my heart. Mr. Eugene Preston Foster, known by all as E.P. It turned out that he was also from Illinois, so we started off with that in common. We were married in August of 1874, and we moved to the Conejo Mountains to live in the first frame house built in the Triunfo Valley to raise sheep on property owned by family friends. Our nearest neighbors were 3 miles away, the Newberry family, for whom Newberry Park is named. I wasn't lonesome, however. At that time, there were so many travelers passing by from Santa Barbara to Los Angeles by team or horseback looking at the land. They were always invited to stop at our little house by the owner of the ranch, Mr. W.H. Mills. Well, with all that company and all the workers that we had on the place, I had a family from 10 to 20 most of the time. Those were the good years, with plenty of rain and grass for the sheep, so the flock grew, as did our family. Our firstborn was Orpha Pearl. Blonde, curly hair, curly pearly, we called her. Well, she was the prettiest thing you ever saw. Now, I know all mothers say that their children are the prettiest, but I was luckier than most. Mine really was the prettiest in the entire family. The next year, Lucy came along. Oh, just before we lost everything in the terrible drought of 1876 and 77. In those days, there were no fences, and the sheep just grazed freely on most of the land from the Conejo Mountains down through Camarillo and beyond. The year before the drought, Mr. Foster sheared 10,000 head of sheep. But by May of 1877, there were only 3,000 of our large flock left. Our lambs and sheep succumbed to starvation and thirst. I hope never again to hear the sound of animals pleading for food and drink, knowing that your livelihood was slipping away with each one that passed away. Mr. Foster drove the remaining sheep that were still alive and sold them for 10 cents a head. We were broke.
Wow.
He'd sunk all our worldly goods into the sheep ranch partnership. We lost everything. Mr. Foster didn't even have enough money to get a ride to Ventura. He walked all the way down the Conejo Grade to look for work. Things were looking pretty grim. Then Mr. Chaffee hired him to work for the Santa Ana Water Company in Ventura as a ditch tender for the princely sum of $40 a month.
Wow.
He was called the superintendent, but his duties consisted of anything that needed to be done, including digging ditches. Mr. Chaffee let us live on the little house on the property. And thanks to my parents believing in a good education for all their children, I was able to help out by keeping the books for the water company. This wasn't the first time that Mr. Foster had to start all over again. He planted an orchard years before and lost it all to the east winds and the grasshoppers. But it was a new and frightening experience for me. Our little Lucy was called to heaven only 4 months after we moved to Ventura. She was but 7 months of age. Oh, it broke our hearts. We rejoiced when Grace arrived in 1879, and next came Edith. In 1881, thanks to steady work and careful management of our money, we were able to build our own home on Ventura Avenue. It's a lovely white Queen Anne style house that we still live in today, with a circular driveway surrounded by all kinds of trees. In addition to working 16 hours a day, Mr. Foster found the time to plant the first large apricot orchard on 200 acres of Mr. J.A. Day's ranch. The deal with Mr. Day was that my husband would plant and tend the orchard for 5 years until the trees came into being. Then he was to receive half the orchard. This deal would form the foundation of our future fortune. After 11 years of marriage in 1885, we welcomed Ida, number 5, and Alec in 1887. Sadly, Alec only survived 6 months. The next year, we felt joyous at the arrival of twin boys, Willis and Frank. But they only lived 4 months before succumbing within 2 days of each other. We seemed to have no luck at all with boys. We cherished our girls even more. Another little girl, Mildred, was born in 1892. And in 1895, Eugene Cheney Foster was born. Both children were healthy and thrived. 10 children and 6 surviving. We considered ourselves lucky indeed. We had friends who fared much worse.
Yeah.
You see, it was a very serious matter for anyone to become sick in those days, especially on the east side of the river during the winter or the rainy season. With the quicksand in the Santa Clara River, it made it impassable. And of course, you know, there was only one doctor in the county, Dr. Bard, who lived in Ventura, and he was Thomas Bard's brother. Later, when the Santa Clara Bridge was built, of course, that made things much easier and safer to both sides of the county. My Mr. Foster has always been an ingenious businessman. He traded his half of the 200-acre apricot orchard for $10,000 in stock in the Bank of Ventura, which had been organized in 1875 by Thomas Bard, the first bank in Ventura County. He got a job as a cashier, and believe it or not, by 1890, he had worked his way up to president of the bank, a position he maintained until 1917, when it was sold to the Bank of Italy. He's still chairman of the board. Thomas Bard and others organized the Union Oil Company in 1890. It was through Mr. Foster's connection with Mr. Bard that he became interested in buying stock in the Union Oil Company. Another smart move which helped our fortune grow even more. We were beginning to prosper thanks to good luck and the generosity of friends, neighbors, and this blessed land. We felt that Ventura County had been very good to us, and we began to think of ways to repay the people and the land that had helped us. We had some extra land on the property where our house in Ventura was on the avenue, and so we donated that for an elementary school. Mr. Foster loved trees and planted many varieties throughout the county, including the star pines on the mission grounds. He and I always liked family picnics and believed that parks should be established so folks could enjoy the land. He never met a bare field or a roadside that didn't need a tree, and saw to it that trees were planted in Grant Park, along the road to Bardsdale, and along the Conejo Grade. There was a pleasant little place that nestled in a grove of oaks on the old creek road in Ojai. Almost everyone who passed by there stopped to enjoy the trees. Mr. Foster was worried that the land would be overcome with logging. And so he went to the Board of Supervisors with his idea of creating a public park to save the wild oak trees and make sure that this beauty spot would be kept for people to enjoy. He persuaded Mr. John Hobson to sell the 21 acres, and we contributed part of the money for the purchase. And so, the county's first park came into being in 1904. It became known as Camp Comfort. Have you ever been there? Well, there was no living with Mr. Foster after that. He began to urge others to set aside land. I can just imagine our landowning friends cringing when they saw him coming. More on that later. We would always stop at another pleasant spot on the Ventura River for a picnic on our way to the Ojai, and we thought it would be a lovely place for a park someday. In 1906, we were able to obtain that spot when we bought 65 acres from the Ayers Ranch and presented it to the county as a park. Later, he encouraged Mr. Chrisman, Mr. Hobson, and the Southern Pacific Railway to donate adjacent lands to increase what would become Foster Memorial Park. Yes, sadly, it was dedicated as a memorial to our little son Eugene, who was claimed by pneumonia when he was only 7 years old. It was a terrible blow to all of us, and I don't think we'll ever really get over it. Thankfully, our 5 girls continued to thrive and went through school, all married except Pearl, who always said that she was just too busy for such things, what with helping me with the younger children and keeping the house. You might have heard that Mr. Foster always wants to be on the forefront of things. He was among one of the first few men in this county to own an automobile. He bought a 4-cylinder Maxwell touring car with kerosene carriage lamps on each side of the dashboard and carbide headlights, but no doors on either side of the 2 front seats. Of course, it had to be cranked, and the horn was a rubber bulb that you squeezed. That was my job, and I applied myself with enthusiasm. In 1910, we drove the Maxwell all the way to San Jose. Our daughter, Grace Percy, her husband, Stephen, and their 2 children caught up with us by train. Then we all toured the northern part of the state, including the Golden Gate Park, which gave us inspiration for a future project. Mr. Foster is still bragging about that trip. Back at home, like I said, we were prosperous now, so we hired a cook, and Pearl looked after the housekeeping. Now I had time to join clubs and committees for the improvement of our community. I became quite active. One group I was involved with was the Camino Real Committee. I was treasurer of the board, and we worked to improve the old Mission Highway for visitors traveling the coast. Maybe you've seen those Mission Bell signposts? You can thank our committee for that. As I became more active, well, I found that Sam the horse and the buggy were just too slow for me to get around town. So, Mr. Foster bought me a 2-cylinder Maxwell runabout for $500. I admit I was a bit cautious about driving an automobile, We'd read in the paper about what happened here in Hueneme with the farm animals and the motor cars in 1910. Farmers were up in arms, saying that the horseless carriages were scaring their animals as they whizzed by the dusty streets. The ladies of the Women's Improvement Club got involved, headed by Mrs. Bard and her sister-in-law, Mrs. Gerbelin. They went to see the constable, and from that point on, stray horses and cows were kept off the streets of Hueneme. So I'm sure you'll understand my hesitancy in learning how to drive the little runabout. Actually, I believe that automobile had it in for me. The first trouble we had with it was the timing. It would kick back enough to wrench my shoulder. It took a few visits to the garage before they finally adjusted it. My next troubles concerned some of the telephone poles on the street corners in town. I finally broke myself of turning before I arrived at the corner. Mr. Foster took great delight in pointing out some of the telephone poles I had left my mark on. Then there was the incident when I was coming home from town one day. Something went wrong with the steering gear on the little Maxwell, and we headed out bumping and bouncing into Carl Vince's bean field. The final episode that cured me of driving that Maxwell occurred one day when I took Grace and little Eugene Percy with me to pick up my baby grandson, Bobby. Well, I was driving, my daughter Grace was holding Bobby, and Eugene sat on the floor on the left-hand side with his feet on the running board. We were coming down Main Street when the Ewings came down Chestnut Street on their way to the train station. They had entered the intersection, and I don't know whether it was impulse or accident, but I stepped on the gas instead of slowing down. They weren't going fast, but their son, who was driving, had turned his head around to find out what his mother was screaming about in the back seat. He struck the Maxwell broadside. We all fell out of the automobile, Grace lying in the street, holding Bobby at arm's length to keep him out of harm's way. Eugene lit out running, and I landed on my hands and knees. Ed Mercer's garage was nearby, so the little Maxwell was tipped back on its wheels and rolled into the garage. Mr. Foster came from the bank and took us home. Other than a few scrapes and severely wounded pride, no one was hurt. But as you can guess, I completely lost any desire to drive after that. The little Maxwell had played its last trick on me. In 1912, we went to Los Angeles for a few days, and Mr. Foster couldn't resist a 7-passenger Winton 6 with a glass front, a top, and 4 doors. The Winton had a 4th gear, which was an overdrive. If the road was level and smooth enough and you got up enough speed, it could be shifted to overdrive and the 48 horsepower engine would maintain the momentum. It also had electric lights and a very commanding horn. Since Mr. Foster didn't want to take his hands off the steering wheel to press the horn button, he gave me that job again. He had the button moved to the front side of the toolbox, and to be sure of making contact, another button was put on the floorboards, which I could press with my foot. Going over the old Casitas Pass Road, I would give it quite a workout. Oh, by the way, that's another project that Mr. Foster was involved with. He was instrumental in the construction of the roads along the ocean, connecting Ventura to Santa Barbara. Well, one day, driving on the newly paved Rincon Road, Mr. Foster got up momentum and shifted into overdrive and was going along whistling a tune when the car in front of us started to pass the one ahead of it and pulled up abreast of it. Mr. Foster said, "Blow the horn, Mother," and I did. Both cars hit the dirt on either side of us, and we sailed through in between. He never lost momentum. Well, enough about our automobile adventures. Let's get back to the parks. Now, let me explain. Mr. Foster is very talented at making money and banking and investments, and he loves automobiles, but his big interests are, of course, trees and parks. Remember that trip to Northern California? Well, shortly after that, we were able to obtain and donate another parcel of land to the county for a park, 65 acres along the ocean side. This donation was inspired by our visit to the Golden Gate Park. We envisioned a playground for the people of the people of Ventura County, like the one in San Francisco, with trails and picnic areas, open lawns, areas for overnight camping, and all sorts of recreation, anything you could think of there. By 1919, 9,000 trees had been planted there, palms, eucalyptus, acacias, Monterey pines, and more. It's well on its way to becoming a miniature Golden Gate Park here in Ventura County. It's become known as the Seaside Park. Oh, I hope that the county keeps it as beautiful as we've planned it. In 1914, the county formed the Board of Forestry, whose purpose was to provide landscaping along the state highway and country roads. Can you guess who was the chairman of the board? Mr. E.P Foster, of course, appointed by the California governor himself. They planted all sorts of trees throughout the county. In 1915, he managed to persuade the Hobson and Faria families to donate the land for Hobson Point Park, a lovely spot along the Rincon Highway, to acknowledge William Dewey Hobson, who is considered the father of Ventura County. Now, have you ever been to Oak Park by the Little Simi River in the hills east of Moore Park? Mr. Foster got the Strathern family to donate those 53 acres to the county, and in 1924, he persuaded the Dennison family to offer 32 acres of their land in the Upper Ojai. Dennison Park is a lovely place for travelers to stop on their trip between Ojai and Santa Paula and provides a grand view of the Ojai Valley. My husband's work has also spread to Santa Paula. In 1926, he influenced Mayor M.L. Steckel to donate a parcel to the county, which became a park named after him. Let's see, have I forgotten anything? Oh, you'll love this. For Christmas, in 1921, Mr. Foster received a book about Andrew Carnegie, as you know, who made his fortune in the steel industry. Mr. Carnegie gave back to the people of this country by building 1,500 libraries in small towns and cities across the country. There's one in Oxnard, built in 1907. Well, this inspired us to purchase the lot on the corner of Main and Chestnut for the library and town hall for the people of Ventura. My husband built the fountain on the grounds himself, and we are very proud of the inscription above the doorway that reads, "Free to all." Well, there is one more gift to the county that Mr. Foster is planning. He's already donated the land for the new hospital, and he plans to set up a trust fund to finance the construction of the hospital with cash and stocks in the Union Oil Company and the Ventura Construction Company. This way, the hospital will never be indebted to creditors. Through all these years, Mr. Foster and I have been a good team. I knew when I first saw him at that picnic in the grove of cottonwoods by the Santa Clara River all those years ago that he was the man for me, and I was certainly right. We celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary a couple of years ago in 1924 in our home on Ventura Avenue with family, friends, and a wondrous cake. I've been blessed with such a fine man and for a husband and wonderful daughters, their husbands, and my grandchildren. This land and its people have been very good to us, and we will continue to repay it for as long as we can.